In the quiet valley of the River Rye, deep within the North Riding of Yorkshire, the ancient stone walls of St. Mary's Abbey rested under a dense blanket of midnight fog. The hour was long before dawn, a time when the world outside was wrapped in complete and undisturbed dark. Inside the dormitory, the air carried the cool, damp draft that drifted perpetually from the river marshes below. Brother Thomas stirred upon his narrow pallet of dry straw and coarse wool. The heavy copper bell in the central tower began its slow and rhythmic swing. The sound was not abrupt, but rather a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the timber beams and stone floor. It summoned the monks from their sleep to the divine office of matins. Brother Thomas sat up slowly, adjusting his heavy dark wool cowl over his shoulders. His leather slippers made only the faintest whisper against the flags of cold limestone as he joined the procession of silent figures moving down the night stairs into the choir. The abbey church was dark save for two beeswax candles burning steadily near the high altar, casting long, gentle shadows against the Norman pillars. The smell of aged oak, damp stone, and spent tallow filled the vast interior. The monks took their places in the carved wooden stalls, their movements practiced and unhurried. As the cantor began the opening chant, the low, monotone voices joined together, filling the vaulted spaces with an ancient, hypnotic melody. The words carried a slow cadence, repeating phrasing that had remained unchanged for generations. The air was still, and each breath formed tiny pale clouds that dissipated into the dim shadows above. For an hour, the psalmody continued without pause, the rhythm of human voice becoming a soft background against the quiet drip of rain upon the leaded roof tiles outside. There was no urgency in the chapel, only the timeless repetition of devotion that marked the passage of the night hours. As the gray light of early dawn began to filter through the oak woods surrounding the abbey, Brother Thomas walked slowly along the narrow bridle path that ran beside the boundary ditch. The morning air was sharp and damp, laden with the earthy scent of wet leaves and decaying timber. His task for the morning was a simple and quiet one: the collection of oak galls, the essential raw material required for the scriptorium's black ink. These small, spherical growths, formed upon the leaves and twigs of the native English oak trees, were rich in tannic acid. He carried a small woven basket of peeled willow osiers resting upon his forearm. With practiced eyes, he scanned the lower branches of the ancient oaks, where the tiny wasps had laid their eggs months before. The galls were hard, rounded nodules, varying in color from soft pale tan to deep chocolate brown. When pinched between thumb and forefinger, they felt dry and woody. Brother Thomas reached up, plucking them one by one with a faint snap that echoed softly in the quiet forest. The woods were entirely still, save for the occasional soft drop of dew falling from leaf to leaf and the distant call of a wood pigeon. He walked slowly from tree to tree, taking care not to disturb the surrounding mosses or lower foliage. He selected only the firmest galls, placing each one gently into his basket until the bottom was covered with a thick layer of the dry, rattle-like spheres. The process required patience and observation, as many galls were hidden beneath the undersides of wet leaves or tucked within the furrows of rough bark. Every handful gathered represented months of future writing, pages of illuminated text that would survive for centuries in the Abbey library. The repetitive motion of searching, picking, and placing brought a quiet rhythm to his morning, allowing his thoughts to settle into the peaceful quiet of the forest. Beyond the stone walls of the outer courtyard, the Abbey pastures sloped gently down toward the river meadow. A thick, sparkling layer of white frost covered the blades of grass, rendering the hillside silver under the pale sky of late autumn. Brother Benedict, the master of the livestock, walked through the wooden gate, his heavy leather boots leaving dark, clear footprints in the crisp, frozen turf. The sheep, a hardy breed of English longwools, were clustered together in the lee of a thick hawthorn hedge, their thick fleeces matted with moisture and cold air. Their gentle breathing rose in faint puffs of steam into the still morning atmosphere. Brother Benedict moved among them slowly, checking each animal with a steady, experienced hand. He examined their fleeces for burrs and moisture, ensuring that the wool remained clean for the spring shearing. The quiet crunch of frosted grass underfoot and the soft, lowing sounds of the cattle in the adjoining pen were the only sounds across the broad expanse of the valley. In the distance, the stone chimney of the bakehouse began to emit a single thin plume of pale gray smoke, indicating that the fire had been rekindled for the day's baking. The frost preserved the landscape in absolute silence, freezing every blade of clover and wild radish in intricate detail. The fence posts, split from aged chestnut wood, were lined with delicate crystals of ice that glistened faintly in the low winter sun. The work in the pastures was measured by the natural movement of the season. There was no need for haste. The animals moved at their own quiet pace, grazing upon the sweetened, frost-bitten grass, while the abbey layout lay tranquil under the morning light. At the edge of the abbey precinct, where the swift current of the mill race rejoined the river, sat the timber-framed tannery shed. The interior smelled strongly of oak bark, damp river water, and iron. Here, Brother Thomas met Brother Anselm, who was responsible for preparing the metallic base for the abbey's ink. On a low oak workbench sat several stone jars and an iron cauldron containing water fetched from the mineral spring nearby. Brother Anselm lifted a heavy clay pot filled with green vitriol, or iron sulfate, which had been produced by evaporating copperous water collected from the local slate quarries. The substance was comprised of small, pale green crystals that clinked softly against the stone ladle. Brother Thomas watched as Anselm carefully measured 2 precise scoops of the green crystals, dropping them into a warm bath of rain water that had been boiled and cooled. The crystals dissolved slowly, turning the clear liquid into a translucent, pale green tincture. To this, Anselm added a small quantity of crushed copperous stones, stirring the mixture with a smooth stick of ash wood. The movement was slow and circular, creating faint ripples that reflected the dim light from the open window hatch. The smell was sharp and metallic, like cold rainwater on weathered iron. This liquid, when later combined with the tannic extract of the crushed oak galls, would undergo a remarkable transformation, turning from pale green to a deep, permanent, indelible black. The process could not be rushed. The solution needed to settle for 3 full days in the cool darkness of the tannery cellar to ensure that all impurities settled to the bottom of the vessel. In the lower courtyard, near the parchment workshop, lay the stone-lined lime pits. These large, square basins were sunk deep into the earth and filled with a thick, milk-white solution of slaked lime and river water. Brother Giles, the master parchment maker, stood near the edge holding a long wooden pole with a flat paddle attached to the end. The air here was dry and powdery from the limestone dust brought from the nearby hills. The purpose of the lime bath was to gently loosen the hair from the calf and sheep skins, preparing them for the delicate scraping process that followed. Brother Giles immersed several raw hides into the white liquid, using the wooden pole to submerge them completely beneath the surface. The water lapped softly against the limestone edges of the pit as the skins sank into the dense, pale solution. The process was slow and chemical, requiring the skins to remain submerged for several days, during which they were turned twice daily with great care. The white lime bath neutralized the natural oils in the skin and softened the tissues, rendering them supple and uniform. The stillness of the courtyard was broken only by the gentle splashing of the liquid and the steady dripping from the wooden paddle as Giles lifted it from the pit. Surrounding the pits were tall stacks of hazel drying hurdles and bundles of dry firewood, waiting for the next stage of production. The entire area operated with a methodical, calm efficiency that had been preserved without change since the founding of the monastery 3 centuries prior. After days spent in the lime pit, the calfskin was thoroughly rinsed in running river water to remove all traces of the alkali. Brother Giles then carried the heavy, wet skin to the stretching frame, known as the hearse. The frame was built from stout timbers of heartwood oak, fitted with adjustable wooden pegs around its perimeter. Using thin cord and small, smooth wooden balls called pippins, Giles secured the edges of the wet skin, wrapping the cord around each pippin and attaching it securely to the tuning pegs. As he turned the pegs, the skin stretched taut across the frame like the head of a drum, water dripping steadily onto the sawdust-covered floor beneath. Taking up his lanellum, a curved, crescent-shaped blade forged from soft steel, Giles stepped up to the stretched membrane. Holding the knife with both hands, he applied it to the surface of the skin at a shallow angle. He began to move the blade downwards in long, smooth, rhythmic strokes. The sharp, curved edge shaved away any remaining hair, fat, and tissue, producing a soft scraping sound that resonated in the high-ceilinged workshop. SHHH, SHHH, SHHH. The sound was steady and comforting, a rhythmic murmur that filled the quiet space. Giles worked with intense focus, feeling the thickness of the skin beneath his thumbs to ensure an even surface across the entire sheet. The damp hide gave off a clean, mild odor of wet leather and river stones. With every pass of the lanellum, the skin grew thinner, translucent, and smoother, gradually transforming from a raw animal hide into a refined parchment sheet ready for the pen. Once scraped clean on both sides, the stretched parchment frame was carried into the covered walkways of the northern cloister. Here, protected from direct sunlight and harsh wind, the air circulated freely through the pointed stone arcades. The frames were leaning against the low ashlar walls, exposed to the soft, damp breeze that blew across the inner garth. Brother Giles walked along the row of frames, testing the tension of each sheet by pressing the center of the membrane with his palm. As the moisture slowly evaporated from the parchment, the skin contracted, pulling tighter against the wooden pegs. Every few hours, Giles returned with a small wooden key to loosen or tighten specific pegs, preventing the delicate membrane from splitting under the tension. The environment of the cloister was remarkably quiet. The only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves in the central garden, the faint footsteps of monks walking between the library and the refectory, and the occasional creak of the oak frames as the wood adjusted to the shifting humidity. The drying process took several days, requiring patience and constant vigilance. If dried too quickly near a fire, the parchment would become brittle and yellow. If left in stagnant air, it would remain damp and spoil. In the cool, shaded arches of the abbey, the skin dried at a perfect, natural pace, turning from a wet gray to a smooth, creamy ivory color that promised a clean surface for scribal work. When the parchment was fully dry and stiff upon the hearse, Brother Giles cut the membrane away from the frame using a small, sharp utility knife. The released sheet gave a crisp, dry rustle as it fell gently onto the broad oak cutting table. Now came the final surface preparation, a task that required a light touch and fine abrasive materials. Giles held a block of volcanic pumice stone in his right hand and a small leather pouch of finely ground chalk powder in his left. He dusted the cream-colored sheet with a faint layer of the white chalk, which served to absorb any lingering traces of natural grease and fill the tiny microscopic pores of the skin. Taking the pumice stone, he began to rub the surface in tight, circular motions. The rough stone rasped softly against the parchment, creating a fine, flour-like dust that coated his fingers. SSS, SSS, SSS. The rhythmic circular motion was continued across the entire face of the hide, first on the flesh side, which was naturally smooth and pale, and then on the hair side, which retained a slightly darker, textured grain. After an hour of careful rubbing, the parchment was wiped clean with a piece of soft, unspun sheep's wool. The surface was now transformed. It was velvety, flat, and remarkably soft to the touch, with a delicate nap that would hold ink precisely without feathering or bleeding. Giles stacked the finished sheets neatly between heavy oak boards to keep them perfectly flat until they were taken up to the scriptorium. In late summer, the abbey farmyard yielded another vital tool for the scribes: the molted primary flight feathers of the farm's flock of gray geese. Brother Thomas sat at a low table in the corner of the scriptorium, sorting through a large bundle of shed feathers that had been collected and stored in dry woven sacks. Not every feather was suitable for writing. He sought only the strong, thick-shafted primary quills taken from the outer wing of the bird. He held each quill up to the light of the high window, inspecting the clarity and thickness of the barrel. The best quills were those shed naturally during the bird's annual molt, as they were fully formed and hard at the base. He selected feathers primarily from the left wing of the bird, as their natural curvature curled outwards, away from the right hand of the scribe during writing, allowing for a comfortable and unimpeded view of the text. He discarded any feathers with split barrels, weak veins, or signs of decay. Each selected quill was roughly 12 inches long, with a firm, translucent shaft that clicked satisfyingly when lightly tapped against the wooden tabletop. Thomas assembled a bundle of 20 fine quills, tying them neatly with a strand of dyed linen thread. These quills, though gathered from simple farmyard birds, were the primary instruments through which the history, theology, and philosophy of the age would be preserved upon the parchment sheets. Before a goose quill could hold ink, it had to be tempered and shaped into a functional writing instrument. Brother Thomas took a raw quill from his bundle and prepared to cure it. He plunged the barrel of the feather into a small iron pot filled with hot, clean river sand that had been heated over a brazier. The brief heat dried out the natural membrane inside the shaft and hardened the flexible horn of the quill, turning it from soft and milky to clear and brittle. After removing the quill from the sand, he scraped away the outer membrane with the back of his small penknife, known as a pen-and-knife. Now came the precise art of cutting the nib. Holding the quill securely between thumb and forefinger, he made a smooth, sloping cut along the underside of the shaft, removing half of the barrel to expose the inner channel. Next, he carved 2 delicate side shoulders, shaping the tip into a narrow, rectangular point. With great care, he made a short, central slit running up the top of the nib, which would act as a tiny reservoir and channel for the ink through capillary action. Finally, resting the very tip of the nib upon a small block of smooth boxwood, he made a single, sharp, perpendicular cut to snap off the microscopic edge, creating a flat, chisel-like writing nib. He pressed the tip gently against his thumbnail. It yielded with a springy, precise flexibility that promised smooth strokes upon the parchment. In a deep ceramic bowl sitting upon the scriptorium hearth, the ingredients for the abbey's ink were brought together at last. Brother Thomas retrieved the basket of oak galls gathered weeks before. Using a heavy iron pestle, he crushed the dry, hollow spheres in a stone mortar. The galls shattered with a series of crisp, dry cracks, releasing a fine tan powder that smelled of dried wood and autumn leaves. He poured the crushed galls into a pot of warm rainwater, allowing them to steep near the gentle heat of the embers for 2 full days. This process extracted the rich tannic acid into a dark brown, tea-like infusion. Once fully steeped, Thomas strained the brown liquid through a piece of coarse linen cloth into a clean glazed jar. Next, he added the green vitriol solution prepared by Brother Anselm. The moment the 2 liquids touched, a dramatic chemical reaction occurred. The clear green solution and the pale brown oak tea instantly turned into a deep, intense, opaque blue-black liquid. To give the ink body, and prevent it from running too freely on the smooth parchment, Thomas added a small quantity of pulverized gum arabic, imported from the Mediterranean trade routes. The resin dissolved slowly, giving the ink a rich, shiny consistency and a silky flow. He stirred the mixture with a smooth cedar stick for nearly an hour, watching the liquid thicken until it coated the sides of the stone pot with a smooth, glossy dark film. While black ink was used for the main body of text, the illuminated initials required vibrant, long-lasting pigments sourced from minerals, plants, and earth. In the bright south corner of the scriptorium sat Brother Martin, the abbey's illuminator. On his heavy marble slab, he was preparing a batch of red pigment known as vermilion. He placed several small lumps of raw cinnabar mineral, a dense, red-tinted stone, onto the center of the slab. Using a heavy stone muller with a flat base, Martin began to grind the stone into a fine powder. Crush, grind, scrape. The sound of stone sliding against stone was soft and rhythmic, filling the quiet corner of the room. He worked in small, circular paths, occasionally using a small horn spatula to scrape the fine red dust back into the center of the slab. The process of grinding pigments was long and physically demanding. The finer the pigment was ground, the smoother it would lay upon the parchment page. For blue, he ground lapis lazuli stone brought by merchants from eastern lands. For green, he used verdigris collected from copper plates exposed to vinegar vapors. For yellow, he ground soft yellow ochre dug from the local clay banks. Each ground powder was gathered into tiny seashells or hollowed horn cups, where it was mixed with a binder of glaire, clarified egg white that had been whipped and settled, and a single drop of clear honey to maintain flexibility and sheen once dried. Before a single word could be written, the blank sheet of parchment needed to be precisely ruled to ensure that every line of text remained perfectly horizontal and uniform across the page. Brother Thomas laid a clean sheet of cream-colored calfskin upon his sloping wooden desk. Using a small bone stylus and an iron ruler, he marked a series of tiny prick marks along the outer margins of the sheet at exact intervals of half an inch. These prickings were made with a double-pointed awl, piercing through several sheets at once to ensure absolute consistency across the entire gathering of pages. Next, he took a lead plummets, a simple rod made of soft lead alloy, and laid his wooden straight edge across the page, aligning it with opposing prick marks. With a gentle, light hand, he drew the lead point across the surface of the parchment. The soft metal left a faint, pale gray line that was barely visible except upon close inspection. He drew line after line, working from the top of the page to the bottom, creating a geometric grid of horizontal text lines bounded by double vertical margin lines. The ruling provided a subtle structure, guiding the scribe's eye and hand without distracting from the beauty of the written letters. The sound of the lead sliding over the textured skin was faint, like a dry leaf dragging across smooth stone. When finished, the parchment presented a beautiful, delicate web of gray lines, perfectly poised to receive the black and red script. By the hour of sext, the sun was at its highest point in the sky, casting a broad shaft of cool, golden light through the stone-mullioned windows of the scriptorium. The room was long and rectangular, situated on the upper floor of the eastern range above the warming room to capture both light and a hint of rising heat. A row of 12 high oak desks ran along the south wall, each angled steeply toward the windows to catch the maximum amount of light without casting the scribe's own shadow over his work. Sitting at his assigned bench, Brother Thomas adjusted his posture. His desk was fitted with a small shelf that held 2 cow horns inserted into circular cutouts, one filled with fresh iron gall ink, the other with clear river water for rinsing his nibs. Beside them rested a small piece of breadcrumb for wiping away accidental specks of wet ink, a small penknife, and a heavy brass paperweight shaped like an oak leaf to hold the curling parchment flat against the inclined board. The only sound in the vast room was the collective whisper of quills moving across parchment, accompanied by the occasional soft turn of a heavy page or the quiet rustle of a woolen habit. The atmosphere was one of deep, serene focus. Every monk worked in total silence, observing the monastic rule that forbade speech within the scriptorium during writing hours. Ideas were communicated through simple hand gestures if an extra tool or fresh ink was required. Brother Thomas dipped the tip of his prepared quill into the dark ink in the cow horn, tapping the side of the horn gently to remove any excess drop. He held the quill at a precise angle of 45 degrees relative to the ruled lines of the page, resting his forearm upon the desk and holding a small bone eraser in his left hand to hold the parchment flat. He brought the nib down to meet the ruled lead line. He began to form the first letter of the text, a grand textualis quadrata letter M. The quill moved down with steady pressure, creating a thick, dark vertical stroke as the broad nib met the page flatly. At the base of the stroke, he gave the quill a slight twist, forming a sharp, triangular serif. He lifted the quill, dipped it again, and drew the sweeping, curved arch of the letter, the ink flowing smoothly from the central slit of the nib onto the absorbent chalk-treated surface. The ink was rich and shiny while wet, reflecting the light from the window before drying into a matte, deep black finish. SCR rich, SCR rich. The sound of the quill upon the parchment was faint and rhythmic, a soft mechanical cadence that accompanied every letter. Thomas moved with absolute deliberation, breathing slowly and evenly, allowing no hesitation in his hand. A single page required thousands of individual pen strokes, each executed with the same uniform angle, width, and spacing. There was no room for hurry. An entire morning's work might yield only 2 or 3 perfectly executed columns of text. In the afternoon, Brother Martin prepared to apply real leaf gold to the grand opening letter of the Gospel manuscript. The area within the drawn outline of the capital letter was first coated with a raised base called gesso, a mixture of fine plaster, white lead, pink bowl clay, and a touch of sugar. The gesso was laid on thickly, creating a soft, rounded cushion that stood slightly proud of the parchment surface. Once the gesso had dried hard, Martin raised the small booklet containing leaf gold, beaten until it was microscopic in thickness, thin enough to float upon a breath of air. He turned his head away and held his breath, for the slightest air movement would tear the delicate metal. Using a small camel hair brush that had been rubbed against his own cheek to generate a faint static charge, he lifted a square of yellow gold leaf from the paper booklet. He gently breathed upon the dried gesso cushion. The tiny amount of moisture from his warm breath reactivated the fish glue binder within the base. He lowered the gold leaf onto the dampened gesso. The gold immediately attached itself to the shape, wrapping over the raised edges like liquid sunshine. He allowed it to settle for a few moments, the raw gold standing out against the pale parchment in a brilliant, metallic square. The delicate leaf appeared suspended on the page, ready to be smoothed and burnished into a mirror-like finish. Once the gold leaf was set securely upon the raised gesso cushion, Brother Martin selected his burnisher, a smooth, rounded dog's tooth mounted into a turned wooden handle. The polished enamel of the tooth was perfectly smooth, free from any scratch that might mar the gold's surface. He placed a sheet of smooth, grease-free tracing paper over the gilded area to protect the soft metal from direct rubbing. Holding the burnisher firmly, he applied steady, firm pressure, rubbing the tool back and forth across the covered gold in short, rapid strokes. Rub, rub, rub. Under the friction and pressure of the hard stone tool, the dull, matte surface of the leaf gold began to consolidate and transform. After several minutes of continuous burnishing, Martin removed the protective sheet and looked down. The gold had turned into a brilliant, reflective mirror, so flat and bright that it caught every flicker of light from the high window, throwing a warm, golden spot onto his habit. To finish the process, he took a small swatch of soft, undyed raw silk cloth and gently buffed the polished gold surface, wiping away any stray flakes that had not adhered to the gesso base. The letter now gleamed like solid metal inlaid into the calfskin page, a bright reflection that would catch the candlelight during evening services in the choir, illuminating the sacred words for the reader. With the main black text written and the gold leaf burnished, the page was ready for its rubrics, the heading lines and instructional notes written in bright red ink to guide the reader through the book. The word rubric itself derived from the Latin ruber, meaning red. Brother Thomas took a small horn pot containing the ground vermilion pigment prepared earlier by Martin. He added a few drops of clear well water and a small splash of glaire, stirring the red mixture with a short goose quill whose tip had been trimmed flat. The color was intense and vivid, a bright scarlet orange that contrasted sharply with the cold black of the iron gall ink and the pale ivory of the parchment. Thomas picked up a clean, sharp quill dedicated solely to red work. He located the first line of the new chapter, where space had been left vacant by the main scribe. He dipped the quill into the scarlet ink and began to trace the introductory words in a slightly smaller, rounded script. The red ink flowed smoothly onto the page, filling the pale lead guidelines with vibrant, warm letters. As he worked down the column, adding red paragraph marks and highlighting the initial letters of each sentence with thin red strokes, the entire page seemed to awaken. The combination of deep black text, gleaming burnished gold, and bright scarlet rubrics created a harmonious visual rhythm that guided the eye across the page in a slow, peaceful progression. As the monastery bells rang for nones, work in the scriptorium ceased. The monks wiped their quills clean, covered their ink horns with small leather caps to prevent evaporation, and stacked their manuscripts neatly within their wooden desks. They walked in silent single file down the cloister arcade toward the refectory for the main meal of the day. The refectory was a high, stone-walled hall with long trestle tables made of heavy oak planks lined along the sides. The monks took their places on simple wooden benches, standing with hands folded into their sleeves until the prior gave the blessing. Once seated, the room fell into absolute silence. No spoken conversation was permitted during meals. Instead, Brother Stephen stood high above the hall in a stone pulpit carved into the wall, reading aloud from a heavy volume of St. Augustine's commentaries. His clear, slow voice echoed off the timbered ceiling, filling the space with steady, rhythmic speech. The monks ate their meal of coarse brown barley bread, vegetable pottage seasoned with herbs from the cloister garden, and a small portion of salted river fish. The only sounds in the hall were the soft clatter of wooden spoons against wooden trenchers, the pouring of small beer from ceramic jugs, and the constant, soothing drone of the reader's voice. The simple food was eaten without rush, offering a period of restful nutrition that restored both body and mind before the afternoon work resumed. While the scribes worked inside the abbey walls, the broader monastic economy extended for miles across the surrounding Yorkshire wolds. Brother Giles, the grange master, rode slowly upon a sturdy pony along the high chalk ridge, overseeing the abbey's vast sheep flocks. The landscape was open, rolling, and uncluttered, covered in short, dense grass that had fed generations of livestock. Below him, thousands of white fleeces dotted the green hillsides like scattered clouds. Two lay brothers, aided by lean gray sheepdogs, were gently moving a flock of several hundred ewes from the upper pasture, down toward the washing fold near the stream. The dogs moved with silent efficiency, circling wide around the edges of the flock at a soft whistle from the shepherd. The sound of hundreds of small hooves moving across the dry chalk turf created a low, continuous rustle, accompanied by the intermittent calling of the sheep and the gentle tinkling of the lead-weather's iron bell. The air on the high wolds was fresh, clear, and carried the scent of wild thyme, clover, and damp earth. From this vantage point, the distant towers of the Abbey Church could be seen nestled in the river valley below, a quiet anchor in the broad landscape. The sheep raised on these hills provided not only the high-quality wool that funded the Abbey's operations through trade with Flemish merchants, but also the continuous supply of fine calf and sheep skins essential for the Scriptorium's ongoing work. In the lower level of the Abbey Grange, far from the quiet of the library, sat the great vertical loom. Here, Brother Robert worked the coarse wool spun by the local villagers into heavy black cloth used for the monks' habits and cloaks. The loom was a heavy structure built from massive ash timbers, fitted with a stone-weighted warp that hung down in hundreds of parallel vertical threads. Robert stood before the frame, holding a long wooden shuttle wound with thick, dark wool yarn. With a rhythmic press of his foot upon the wooden treadle, he opened the shed, the space between alternate warp threads. He passed the shuttle through the opening with a smooth slide of his hand. Clack, slide, thump. He pulled the heavy wooden reed forward to press the new weft line firmly up against the woven cloth above. Clack, slide, thump. The continuous, steady rhythm of the loom was mesmerizing, a mechanical dance that had remained unchanged for centuries. The room smelled of raw wool, lanolin, and dry wood dust. The gray light from the high, narrow window illuminated millions of tiny wool fibers floating in the air, drifting slowly like winter dust motes. The cloth produced here was dense, water-resistant, and durable, capable of enduring years of daily wear in the unheated stone halls of the monastery. Robert worked with a calm, practiced motion, adding inch after inch to the bolt of black cloth that wound slowly onto the lower roller. Across the outer farmyard, the great stone tithe barn stood undergoing seasonal repairs. High upon a timber scaffold resting against the steep roof line, Brother Peter, the Abbey builder, was rethatching a section of the broad roof with fresh water reed gathered from the river marshes. Below him lay neat, tightly bound bundles of yellow reeds, each 3 feet long and stiff as straw. Peter held a wooden legget, a flat, notched tool used to drive the ends of the reeds upward into a tight, uniform surface. He lifted a fresh handful of reed, laid it flat against the existing thatch layer, and secured it to the horizontal hazel battens beneath using a flexible loop of twisted willow switch. Taking his mallet, he tapped the butt ends of the reeds upward, compressing them into a dense, solid mat through which no rain or wind could penetrate. Thump, tap, tap. The dull, soft sound of wood striking reed echoed across the yard. The dry straw smelled sweet and sun-baked, filling the crisp air with the scent of late summer harvests. Peter worked methodically across the roof line, creating a smooth, sweeping plane of pale yellow thatch that stretched from ridge to eaves. A well-laid reed thatch would protect the stored grain within the barn for over 40 years, keeping out moisture, frost, and nesting birds through the long northern winters. As the afternoon light began to turn cool and blue, Brother Cuthbert pushed a heavy wooden handcart loaded with split logs along the stone pathway toward the chapter house. The logs were cut from local coppiced ash and oak, harvested during the previous winter and seasoned for a full year under dry open sheds. The bark was rough, gray, and encrusted with pale green lichen that flaked off under his heavy leather work gloves. Cuthbert stopped beside the stone wood store located adjacent to the chapter house chimney. He began to stack the logs in a neat, geometric wall against the masonry. He placed each piece with care, laying the outer edges slightly higher than the center to ensure that the stack remained stable and well ventilated. The sound of wood clinking against wood, a series of dry, sharp thuds, punctuated the afternoon quiet. Thud, clack, thud. The scent of dry wood, oak bark, and moss was crisp and pleasing. This wood would feed the great stone fireplace in the chapter house, where the monks gathered each morning to hear a chapter of the monastic rule read and to discuss the temporal business of the abbey estate. A proper stack of seasoned firewood was essential for survival during the long months when snow blocked the passes over the Yorkshire wolds, and ice formed on the water basins inside the cloister. In the copper-lined brewhouse, the air was warm, thick, and sweet with the rich aroma of malted barley and drying hops. Brother Clement stood upon a low wooden platform beside the great wooden mash tun, holding a long ash paddle with a perforated end. The tun was filled with hot water drawn from the abbey well and crushed barley malt that had been dried over peat fires in the kiln. Clement stirred the sweet mash slowly, turning the thick, grain-filled liquid to ensure that the starches converted fully into fermentable sugars. The movement was smooth and circular, creating deep swirls in the dark brown liquid. Steam rose off the tun in thick, soft clouds, condensation running down the cold stone walls in tiny clear streams. After hours of mashing and straining, the liquid, now known as sweet wort, was boiled in a copper cauldron with dried hop flowers gathered from the abbey hop garden. The hops imparted a delicate bitterness and preserved the brew against spoiling. This was the preparation of small beer, a low-alcohol, nutritious beverage consumed daily by every member of the community in an age when raw river water was often unsafe to drink. The gentle bubbling of the copper cauldron and the comforting, bread-like smell of the boiling grain created a cozy, tranquil environment within the dark stone workshop, offering protection against the damp mist rising outside. Enclosed within 4 high stone walls near the infirmary lay the abbey herb garden, or physic garden. Here, arranged in neat, rectangular raised beds bordered by woven wattle fencing, grew dozens of medicinal herbs, plants, and flowering roots. Brother Anthony, the abbey infirmarian, knelt in the soft, dark soil of a bed dedicated to marsh mallow and comfrey. He carried a small iron trowel and a shallow wooden trug lined with clean canvas. His task was to harvest the long, thick roots of the comfrey plant before the ground froze hard for the winter. Comfrey, known as knitbone, was widely used to make soothing poultices for bruises, sprains, and fractured limbs. Anthony dug carefully around the base of the plant, loosening the damp, rich earth until the thick, dark root could be gently lifted without snapping. He wiped away the clinging soil with his fingers, revealing the pale interior beneath the dark outer skin. The garden was completely quiet, sheltered from the autumn winds by its high walls. The air was rich with the aromatic scents of bruised sage, dried lavender, rosemary, and damp earth. Anthony laid the roots gently into his basket, moving on to check the late harvest of dried lavender blossoms and poppy seed heads stored in small linen bags under the porch roof. Every plant here was catalogued in the abbey's herbal manuscript, its properties carefully copied by generations of scribes to treat the sick and elderly monks in the infirmary. Back in the quiet scriptorium, the written and illuminated pages of the new manuscript had completed their long journey of creation and were now ready to be assembled into a complete book. Brother Thomas lay several finished sheets of calfskin parchment flat upon his broad workbench. Each sheet contained 4 pages of text, written on both sides in double columns. To turn these large, flat sheets into a bound book, they needed to be folded precisely into quires or gatherings. Thomas picked up the first sheet, holding it up to the light to check the alignment of the top margin prickings. He folded the sheet in half across its width, hair side to hair side and flesh side to flesh side, ensuring that the texture and tone of adjacent pages matched perfectly. He ran a smooth bone folder along the fold line, applying firm, even pressure to create a sharp, flat crease. SSS-lick. The bone folder slid across the tough skin with a crisp, dry sound. He nested 4 folded sheets inside one another, creating a single gathering of 16 pages known as a quaternio. He repeated this process for all 30 gatherings that comprised the entire text of the manuscript. Once folded, he stacked the quires together, placing them under a heavy screw press made of solid oak timbers. He turned the iron handle, lowering the upper press board to flatten the gathers overnight, driving out any trapped air between the pages and preparing the spine for stitching. On the following morning, Brother Thomas set up his sewing frame, a sturdy wooden apparatus featuring 2 vertical threaded wooden screws holding a crossbar, from which thick cords of twisted hemp hung down tautly. These cords would form the flexible raised bands along the spine of the book. Thomas placed the first quire flat upon the baseboard of the frame, aligning its spine against the vertical hemp cords. He threaded a long, curved iron needle with strong, unbleached linen thread that had been thoroughly coated with pure beeswax to make it smooth and resistant to dampness. Piercing the parchment at the original kettle stitch mark near the top of the quire, he passed the needle inside the fold, pulling the thread through until it caught against a small knot. He guided the needle out through the spine, looping the linen thread tightly around the first vertical hemp cord before passing it back into the quire. Pull, slide, snap. The thread pulled tight against the parchment with a quiet, satisfying click. He moved down the spine, looping around each of the 4 hemp cords in turn, before passing out at the bottom kettle stitch. He then laid the second quire on top of the first, repeating the stitching path in reverse and linking the thread securely to the quire below. Layer by layer, quire by quire, the individual gatherings were bound together into a strong, flexible text block, securely anchored to the stout cords that would later be attached to the book's wooden covers. With the text block securely stitched, the book required strong protective covers to keep the parchment flat and shield the delicate writing within. Brother Thomas retrieved 2 thick boards carved from quarter-sawn English oak, shaped and planed to fit the exact dimensions of the manuscript pages. Along the spine edge of each board, he had chiseled narrow channels and drilled small angled holes to receive the ends of the hemp sewing cords. He threaded the loose ends of the 4 cords through the edge holes of the oak boards, pulling them tight until the wood sat flush against the spine of the text block. He secured the cords by driving small, dry oak pegs into the holes, locking the wooden boards permanently to the book block. Next, he selected a piece of thick, vegetable-tanned pigskin leather dyed a deep, earthy brown. He pasted the leather over the wooden boards and spine using a thick paste made from boiled wheat flour and alum. He smoothed the soft leather over the oak boards using a wooden bone tool, pressing it firmly around the raised cords on the spine to form decorative ridges. Finally, he fitted 2 cast brass clasps to the outer edges of the boards. These clasps held the heavy book firmly closed under constant pressure, preventing the parchment pages from warping or expanding when exposed to shifting room humidity. As the late afternoon shadows lengthened across the cloister garden, the great bell rang for vespers. The day's manual labor was at an end. Brother Thomas stood up from his workbench, stretching his tired fingers and back after long hours spent over the binding table. He looked down at the completed manuscript resting upon his desk. Its heavy oak covers bound in dark brown leather, its brass clasps gleaming softly in the fading daylight, holding within its pages months of patient, quiet labor. The scriptorium was filling with a gentle blue twilight, the sharp angles of light softening into deep, peaceful shadows. Thomas joined the silent line of monks walking down the cloister arcade toward the church. The air outside was cold, crisp, and still, carrying the distant smell of wood smoke from the abbey kitchen and the damp foliage of the river valley. Inside the choir, the evening candles were lit, casting soft golden halos against the stone arches. The community knelt in their wooden stalls as the solemn, slow tones of the Magnificat rose into the high stone vaults. The music was gentle and unhurried, reflecting the deep, continuous peace that governed every aspect of Abbey life. There was a sense of profound fulfillment in the air, the quiet satisfaction of work completed in harmony with the natural rhythm of the day. The final hour of the monastic day arrived with the ringing of the bell for Compline. Night had fallen completely over the valley of the Rye, wrapping the abbey in deep, undisturbed quiet. The monks gathered once more in the choir for the night prayers, their voices joining in the ancient hymn Te Lucis ante terminum, asking for protection during the silent hours of sleep. After the final blessing and the sprinkle of holy water, the strict order of great silence descended upon the monastery. No word would be spoken by anyone until after prime the following morning. The monks walked quietly back up the night stairs to the dormitory, their soft leather shoes making no sound against the worn stone steps. Brother Thomas reached his small wooden pallet in the dormitory. A single tallow candle burned upon an iron wall sconce nearby, casting a warm, flickering light across the plain, whitewashed wall. He unclasped his heavy outer cloak and folded it neatly at the foot of his bed. As he lay down upon his simple straw mattress and pulled the thick wool blanket up to his shoulders, he listened to the gentle sounds of the night. The soft rustle of straw as his brothers settled into their beds, the faint whisper of wind moving through the high leaded glass windows, and the steady, distant rush of the river flowing over the mill dam outside. He reached out and gently blew out the candle flame. The last thin curl of sweet smoke drifted upward into the darkness, leaving the quiet dormitory wrapped in complete, soothing peace.